some people are, born a little bit more mentally tough than others, or resilient is similar, but it's certainly something that you can develop. These psychological skills, I usually say they're a bit of a triple whammy, because they can help reduce mental illness, they can help enhance mental well-being, and they can help enhance performance and capability as a human being.
Well, hello, Suzy, and welcome to our Finding Equilibrium podcast. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. It's like super hot here in Sydney, and I guess it's super hot where you are as well.
It is. It's very warm. Thanks very much, Lawrence, for speaking with me today.
Yeah, well, I've read your book, and I have to say, and I'd like to almost start there, because it's an amazing read, particularly at a time when everything's changing and we're all having to deal with uncertainty and ambiguity. It feels like you've got a recipe for how people can really cope with these turbulent times. So I'd love you to just give me a little bit of the background of why you wrote the book and a little bit of your story, how you came to doing what you're doing now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's off the back of 20 years of practice as a psychologist. It took me a long time. It was quite a long journey to, I guess, gain my doctorate in clinical psych. I think 8 years and 2 children later. And so it's probably been even longer that I've been, working within the field of psychology, but definitely practicing for over 20 years. And I'm a clinical psych by background, so I was really thrown in at the deep end, I think, in hindsight, in working with people that were very psychiatrically unwell in the early days. And then I moved more into coaching psychology, and I worked as an executive coach for over 10 years. And then for about the last 8 years, I've been running the Positivity Institute, and we don't offer clinical counselling services, but we try to take a much more proactive approach to well-being. So after years of treating and diagnosing, as a traditional clinical psych would do, I realised actually very early on that we needed mental health prevention and promotion. And so that's sort of what drove me into that area. And it's still a large part of what drives me is the desire to see reductions in mental illness, combined with the desire to see people live their absolute best lives in the very short time that we have on the planet.
Yes, no, that's wonderful. And I share that passion. So it's really interesting. So in the beginning of your career, because one thing that's very interesting in psychology, and I studied psychology myself at undergraduate level, and I think it's really, what's interesting is that you do spend all of your time focused on the negative things, the things that go wrong. And I remember I did my dissertation on humor, like the psychology of humor. And at the time, this was a long time ago, it was like really hard to research it, like really hard. And that was like before positive psychology came along, but there was like nothing, like hardly any studies. And
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, I knew I wasn't going to be a clinical psych for long when I got in trouble for having too much laughter coming from my clinical room. But of course we now know it's a strength. Yes, it can be a defense mechanism, but it is a strength, in so many ways. So
it is. And people are all given those gifts. So what's very interesting, I think, about you is that you've got that clinical psychology background and you've got the executive coaching background, and how you've combined that together to create a methodology to be positive. So tell me more about the methodology that you talk about. I know you write about in your book, like where people are. And I know a lot of people at the moment are struggling with all kinds of mood disorders, which is understandable. But if you're talking to someone like that who really is not necessarily looking through a lens of positivity at the moment, but looking through a lens of fear and worry, and what would you advise that person, like where to start to be able to get on a better path?
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of my mission is to continue to destigmatise and encourage people to seek professional psychological or psychiatric assistance. I usually say it's not like New York here in Australia, and I dare say perhaps London as well, although I think perhaps London might even be more advanced when it comes to people having therapy. So I think I'd love to see people engage more proactively in a therapeutic setting. But really the model that I created has come about from using, evidence-based psychological knowledge and skills in both a clinical setting, but also in an executive coaching setting. So I sort of discovered that they were the same skills that I was teaching people, but used just slightly differently. So for example, cognitive behavioral techniques, or, more, what's being used now, more ACT-based approaches, acceptance and commitment training or therapy. You can use those therapeutically, but they're equally as effective for somebody that's looking for, high levels of performance, if you like, or high levels of well-being. So these skills are really for everybody, which is why also a part of our business is in positive education. So we actually work directly with the teachers, but kids are learning these skills at school now.
So kids are learning these skills, and in the workplace as well. Have you seen, it's an interesting time, but in the last 20 years, the whole area of positive psychology has really expanded. And have you seen that grow exponentially this year with everything that's been happening?
Interestingly, I guess the focus has been more on resilience and mental toughness than well-being per se, from our perspective anyway. We also use a scientifically validated model of mental toughness, which is quite appealing because it's quite a user-friendly model to sort of unpack, particularly a large multi-dimensional construct like resilience. So there's been, I guess particularly in the early days with COVID, we were doing lots of resilience and mental toughness, but we've seen the tide turn, and now people are asking for, positivity at work, or the power of positivity, and a much more well-being focus as we're coming out of the COVID, at least here in Australia.
Yes, no, it's true. So mental toughness, what would that cover, and what would you talk about in a mental toughness program?
Yeah, well, it's as I mentioned, quite a simple model. It's based on quite a lot of rigorous scientific research. It's created by a sports psychologist, actually, out of the UK, and building on some earlier research around cognitive hardiness. But very simply, it's 4 C's, which is challenge, control, confidence, and commitment. So, as I mentioned, resilience is a big, unwieldy topic or concept, if you like. So being able to unpack it and look at confidence in my abilities, interpersonal confidence. So that's sort of broken down into 2 components. Commitment, how committed am I to setting a goal and progressing with it? Challenge, how willing am I to stretch myself and feel the discomfort, for the purpose of growth, if you like. And that's where mental toughness differentiates a little bit from resilience, because resilience, something happens to you and it's how you respond. Whereas mental toughness, we know that people that report higher levels of mental toughness proactively seek out growth opportunities. They don't wait for the curveballs to come. And then the other one is control, and that's broken up into emotional control, and that's how well you manage your emotions, emotion regulation, and life control, And life control is very much like that concept of locus of control, and whether you believe you have some level of control or mastery over the environment, or whether you believe you're a victim of circumstance. So it's it's a very simple model to help people sort of, think about their own levels around those 4 C's and determine where they have strengths and where perhaps they want to develop those areas, because it is developable.
Yeah, and I suppose that's the key point, really. So if someone did, and is there a tool or a survey that helps people understand where they are in terms of their own mental toughness, and then you can decide what to do. But the belief is that everybody can improve this area.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do know that it sits on the old bell curve, like most psychological constructs. So most people sort of sit in the middle with scores of 4 to 7 on a scale of 1 to 10, and those that report higher in the 8 to 10, what we might call more mentally tough, although you can get quite a lot of variation between the 4 C's. You could be high on interpersonal, could be quite high on confidence in abilities, but not be so high on interpersonal confidence, for example. And then if you score lower, 1 to 3, it's referred to as mental sensitivity, not mental weakness by any means, just mental sensitivity. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But we do know from the research that it's particularly relevant, mental toughness, in stress, pressure and challenge. So if it's an occupation where there's a lot of stress, pressure and challenge, if you're not born, and it is trait-like, so some people are, born, I guess, a little bit more mentally tough than others, or resilient is similar, but it's certainly something that you can develop. And in fact, that's many of the psychological skills that I cover in the book are skills that we would either have taught you reactively after you perhaps had a curveball and weren't coping that well, or we would have given to you in a proactive mechanism for coaching to help you achieve a stretch goal, for example. So again, they're really well validated psychological capabilities that can be learned, and that's sort of the whole gist of the book, I guess.
It is. So let's talk about some of those ideas and some of the tools that you raise. What I really like about the book is that it's a coaching program in itself, isn't it? Because you go through it and you do the exercises, you get a lot of self-knowledge, self-awareness, and then you can really, if you really stick with it, you can really evolve and develop your own habits and behaviors in a very positive way. So you've got 6 steps. From memory, it starts with mindset.
Mood.
Starts with mood. Go ahead.
Yeah, starts with mood because I guess, from my experience, people don't know actually a whole lot about our mood states. What's the difference between an emotion and a mood, and it looks at the importance of the full range of human emotions. And whilst, in the early days, positive psychology was criticised about it being a happyology, which, by the way, it is not. I usually say, as a clinical psychologist, they will lock you up if you walk around all day with that happy yellow smiley face. But we do focus, because the field of positive psychology, a large part of the research has occurred around positive emotions such as joy and gratitude, elevation, which when I was training as a psychologist, I never had lectures on those. I had lectures on fear, anger, shame, disgust and guilt.
Me too. So, exactly. Nothing about positive emotions. Yeah.
That's right.
Okay, so you start with mood and then it's meaning, is that right?
No, mood, motivation. Then we look at
okay, it's completely wrong. Okay.
I think you're going from the back to the front.
I'm looking at a diagram. Yeah, it's okay. It's not.
That's
sequential.
all right.
Cool.
But yeah, motivation is really looking, I guess, particularly in chapter 2, because then we're looking at what is your motivation for, I guess, learning the 6 M's, and if you are taking it on as a self-coaching project, trying to understand, what's driving you to do it, because we've got about 40 years of research on goals and their impact on our well-being, actually, in psychological research. So there's a lot that we can learn and apply when it comes to actually setting a goal that's going to support our well-being rather than undermine our well-being. So yeah, so there's a lot that I had to cover in a small chapter, actually, but yeah.
No, that's great. So then I won't guess what the next one is.
It's meaning.
Meaning, okay.
Sorry, I've got that incorrect. It's might, actually.
Might. Okay. Okay.
Might,
so it's mood, motivation, might.
Might, that's it. And the reason, I guess I took a little bit of creative license here, because as I started to map these psychological skills out, I noticed that, wow, they're all starting with M, so but when it came to strengths, it didn't quite work. So I was a little bit creative and made it might.
I like that. That's good. I thought I hadn't seen that one before, because you hear a lot of strength-based work, but might-based work is good.
Yeah. So, and particularly whilst there are performance strengths out there that perhaps your audience will be familiar with, particularly in the workplace setting, for example, the Gallup Strengths Finder or the UK CAP Strengths Profile, that I focus primarily on the VIA character strengths, because it's just a beautiful introduction to strengths if you're new to a strengths-based approach. And it's also about you as a virtuous human being as well. What are the traits of a virtuous human being that we can all aspire to?
Wonderful. No, I love that. So you've got your mood and you're understanding your moods. So with a view to becoming to experiencing more positive moods, and then your motivation, which is why do you want to change, and then your might is really understanding what you're good at, what your strengths are. Because I know in our society, and I think you cover this in the book, that we are predisposed to focus more on the negatives than the positives.
Absolutely. So we've got to work extra hard with that negativity bias and focus on the things that we can do. And I think, Lawrence, perhaps like your country of origin, Australia is very much the same. We haven't been encouraged to talk about our strengths.
No.
So high degree of modesty and humility. So it's actually a wonderful to use the assessment. Is just gives people a language and something that they can refer to, because often if you ask, I know having worked with hundreds of clients, if you ask them for a list of their strengths and their weaknesses, they come back with a long list of weaknesses and hardly any strengths. So to be able to have a tool to help can be really very helpful.
It's extremely helpful. I remember when I first came across this whole school of thought around strengths. It is a whole mindset shift, because we are brought up at school to focus on the highest grades, and if you get 6 A's and 1 B, the B gets far more attention than the 6 A's, and it's just the way that our culture has brought us up.
It's so true. We've been socialised to it. It is starting to change in schools slowly, and I would suggest slowly in workplaces as well, thankfully.
Well, I think the tools that are becoming widely available, the ones that you mentioned, really help, because it makes it much more quantifiable, and having people who can really guide people and just help them recognize that it's fine to focus on your strengths rather than this modesty, where we're not encouraged to do that, as you say. Okay, so from might we go to, is it mindfulness? Meaning. Okay. 50-50. Okay, so talk to me about meaning.
Yeah, so as I said, I've been in this field for a long time, and I recall doing a bit of a literature search back in about 2004, 2005. There was hardly any research, psychological research. There was Frankl's book on Man's Search for Meaning, which I think it's popping up everywhere at the moment.
It really is. It's such an amazing book, but it is very well quoted.
It is. It's a wonderful book, but there is now quite a significant amount of research on meaning in life generally, but also meaning at work. There's lots of research as well. And there's also some great tools that we can use if you've lost your mojo, and perhaps you think, I can't leave this job. There's some great scientific research around what's called job crafting. So ways that you can bring your strengths to work. And look, you may not ever feel ecstatic about the role, but there's certainly a way that you can feel a little bit better and a bit more hopeful about and a bit more energized by aligning your values, if you can possibly do that, and doing a little bit of crafting, as I said, around using your strengths, and even just reframing the way that you look at your work as well.
That's really interesting. So job crafting, is that a tool, or how can people access that?
Well, I've outlined it in my book. It comes out of the Centre for Positive Workplaces at the University of Michigan, and they've been researching, I guess, the application of positive psychology in organisational settings for probably nearly close to 15 years now. If you go to their website, you could be on there all day. There's so much wonderful research, but they are the ones that actually created the tool. You can purchase, I think, the actual tool that will talk you through it, but I have given a bit of an overview in the book that is probably sufficient to get people started on it anyway.
Now that sounds great, because I know a lot of people this year has forced people to reset and review and question whether the jobs they're doing are the right jobs, and is there something different that they're doing. So these tools are going to be very helpful for people for sure. Thank you for that. So, and then after mindfulness, after meaning, we go to mindfulness.
That's it. And look, in many ways, mindfulness could have been at the very beginning, because we referred to it as the foundation of flourishing. And I haven't mentioned it, but we do use the F word a lot in positive psychology, which is flourishing. And it's called the foundation because if you don't have a level of mindfulness or just basic awareness, you're not going to be, mindful of looking for a strength in someone, or thinking that I can use a strength in this situation, or understanding what's motivating me, and we haven't got to it yet, but it's particularly important when we get to mindset, because if you haven't got a level of mindfulness, you're not going to be able to catch those, the automatic negative thoughts, the ants we call them. So it really, as I said, is a foundation for our psychological well-being. And the research, it's very hard to argue with the research at this point in time in terms of the multiple benefits that it can give to us.
I mean, it really is. It's layer after layer now, isn't it, in terms of mindfulness? And it's really become much more popular in the corporate context. Just over the last 5 years, I've seen it really start to change.
Yeah.
Cool. And then the last step is mindset. So
that's it. Yeah, and that's really been, the bread and butter of psychologists for decades. Is so if someone was suffering with particularly, like a common cold of psychology, like depression and anxiety, our most evidence-based treatment for years has been cognitive behavioural therapy, which has been very effective in helping people reduce, levels of disorders like depression and anxiety. And I mentioned before some of the newer, although they're not that new anymore, but acceptance and commitment therapy is getting lots and lots of support also about its approach and the outcomes that it can have. But in very simply, in cognitive behavioural techniques, we become aware of these ants, these automatic negative thoughts, and then we actually can challenge them or question them, and take a different perspective on the situation, and that change in thought, in thinking, can then affect our emotional state and our behavioural state. That's the gist of it. As I said, it's very effective. Lots of research. It doesn't work for everybody. I know I've had clients that end up getting into a battle with their ants. They're sort of going backwards and forwards between their ants and their pets, which are the performance-enhancing thoughts, which is why some of the newer ACT-based approaches can be really powerful. They're much more mindfulness-based, so you become more mindfully aware of the thoughts that you're having, but you may choose not to fight with them at all. You may choose to just observe them, sit with them, let them pass, and then move in a values congruent direction. So there's a beautiful, values are brought beautifully into ACT-based approaches. And I talk quite a lot about values in the motivation and the meaning chapters as well. So these basic thinking skills have been around for a very long time. But yes, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, really, they've not been taught to children at school in the main, and they've not been taught to adults in the workplace either. So, I still am surprised when we run some basic training on this, that people have major ahas, that, they don't have to be a slave to their thinking.
It's strange, isn't it, that, because as you say, there's been decades of research that has shown that this is very beneficial, particularly from a proactive prevention approach, and yet it hasn't found its way into education of children and adults until now. It feels now it's really starting to be recognized, whereas previously not. Why do you think that is? Why has it taken so long?
Look, I think we should acknowledge there have been some very successful SEL, social and emotional learning programs in the US, and I do believe in the UK, and I believe in a smaller way here in Australia. I think we've had such a focus on academics, and I think most people would agree that unfortunately has undermined well-being, particularly in senior high school students, which is where we've seen increasingly high levels of anxiety, for example. And it really, I think, I know when I first started working in this field, it was coming off the back of these increasing rates of particularly depression and suicide in schools. But now I think after 10 years, the field of positive education has been going now, and we're now starting to see that I guess educators and parents are seeing it as we said, a very proactive way, but that it also beneficially impacts general psychological well-being, and it also impacts capability and performance and academic achievement. So these psychological skills, I usually say they're a bit of a triple whammy, because they can help reduce mental illness, they can help enhance mental well-being, and they can help enhance performance and capability as a human being. So they're great skills, and that's why I guess I pulled them all together, because I knew from the science, but even more so from having worked with lots and lots of people, and from my own self, Lawrence, having used them, just what a big difference that they can make to someone's life.
Wow, and that's incredible, because they're the big topics that everyone's actually changing. So you mentioned your own self, and obviously you've got a huge amount of knowledge. But what would a typical day like? How do you use these tools to make sure that you remain positive in your outlook? Because you're running a business, you have lots of demands on your time as well. And I often say sometimes we don't always do what we know. From your perspective, I mean, which are the tools that are most effective in your own life?
Yeah, and I guess I want to acknowledge that, because I mean, I'm a fairly, as you said, educated and sophisticated user of these tools, having used them for about 30 years now. But through, particularly when COVID first hit, and I run a small business, I could see my ants starting to come and get into a bit of a downward spiral at 3 a.m. in the morning, when all of our work was cancelled or postponed. But, thankfully, I do have those skills. So I was able to pick myself up, write down the ants. I mean, that's one of the techniques that we recommend to people, is get them out of your head, because on paper, they're not as scary as when they're in your head. When they're in your head, you believe them to be true, but when they're on paper, you can look at them a little bit more rationally. So those sort of thinking skills have really, when you learn them, it's quite hard to learn them and shift your thinking when you're first learning. But after a period of time, it just becomes, you think differently. So I don't even think how I used to think years ago. Like, I think, and with, paired with the beauty of age and maturity, I think that definitely helps. But, definitely some of those basic thinking skills have changed my life. I can assure you of that. I have a family history on both sides of my family of anxiety and depression. I was probably blessed with a fairly robust mood, possibly more the anxiety, which has, driven me, to want to succeed and not fail. But definitely the thinking skills have changed my life. And then in the last 10 years, the mindfulness and meditation has made a huge difference also to my general well-being. And particularly when I've been stressed, I know that doing some form of mindfulness meditation is going to help. I have regular exercise routine. I can't imagine not having exercise. I think it's helped manage my anxiety for many years, having, regular exercise. And there are times when I will pull out the good old, I guess, gratitude journal. It's not something that I generally do anymore, because I think when I first realised that I needed to be a little bit more grateful back in my 30s, I think I had a bit of an epiphany. Then it really helped at the time, but over a period of time, I just became a much more appreciative person. But going through COVID, I have reverted to that. And I thought, just in terms of overcoming that negativity bias, focus on what you do have, focus on what is going well. So I do absolutely try to walk my talk and use as many tools as I possibly can.
No, that's wonderful. And for someone who's listened to this and they recognize that they have a lot of thinking errors, let's say, and they're not thinking about that, they haven't got any of these tools in place, how quickly can someone start to see improvement if they're literally starting from a position of, let's say they're not clinically depressed, but they're just in a state of panic, fear, anxiety, they're running a small business, they're feeling overwhelmed with decisions and fearful about the future.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction, because having worked, as I mentioned in my early days, with people that were quite unwell, these skills, the thinking skills, can be very hard. And in fact, sometimes an antidepressant might just help, not everybody, but for some people it might reduce the number of negative thoughts to help be able to use these skills. But when, for example, I was using it with executives and in an executive coaching role, even though they'd never really learnt it, they pick it up really, really quickly. So if you're not struggling, clinically, my experience has been people can learn these skills fairly quickly and start applying them relatively quickly. Again, you might want to use a tool like writing it down rather than trying to do it in your head initially. It's very hard to just do it in your head when you're first learning. That's been my experience. And also engage a co-coach or a buddy, so you can, because one of the techniques in basic cognitive behavioural therapy is to ask yourself, what would I say to a friend if they were having this thought? And it's so easy if we think about a friend. We've often got the perfect response if somebody says, comes up with a negative thought, but it's very hard to do it to ourselves. So
we can be very mean to ourselves, can't we, with our own internal dialogue?
We really can. And so it can be great to have a bit of a buddy, and perhaps, again, having two people read the book at the same time and be able to sort of, in a sense, co-coach each other and support each other through it. But again, there's real benefit in, you don't have to be clinically depressed to see a therapist and or a coach proactively as well.
That's wonderful. So let's wrap up now. I'm conscious and I want to be respectful of your time. So where can people find out more? So the Positivity Prescription, a 6-week wellbeing program based on the science of positive psychology, a brilliant book. I have to say, I've read it, and it really will move you forward in a big way. I love the way you've integrated those 6 different disciplines, because sometimes it can feel very piecemeal if you're trying to create your own wellbeing, like personal wellbeing strategy. There's so many different things, it can be quite overwhelming. But I love the way you've integrated those together so that you can ultimately create a daily plan effectively to start to improve the way you think and the way you perceive life. So congratulations for doing that. Where can people find out more about you, access the book, and find out more about the business that you run?
Yeah, absolutely. At our website, thepositivity-institute.com.au, and but you can also purchase the book through online booksellers as well. But yeah, please don't hesitate to email if there are any specific resources or anything that we can do. Please don't hesitate to reach out.
Wonderful. And let me acknowledge you for the amazing work that you've done over the last 30 years. I mean, it's incredible. Everyone says, this is the time where all of that hard work that you've done has really come together, because more and more people need the tools and the knowledge and support that you provide. So thank you very much for doing what you do.
Thank you so much, Lawrence, and thank you also for the work that you do.
Thank you. We'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.